Consider for a moment the nature of collapse. Not the slow erosion of mountains over millennia, but the sudden fracture of systems that proclaimed themselves eternal. History gives us many examples, yet few as dramatic as what unfolded in the spring of 1945 across the dying landscape of the Third Reich. In these final hours, as a regime that promised to last 1,000 years crumbled in exactly 12 years and 3 months, we witnessed something profound about human nature, about power, and about the women who stood beside those who wielded it. What follows is not merely a story of endings, but of transformations so complete they challenge our understanding of identity itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. April 30th, 1945. The date itself carries no special significance in the cosmic calendar. Yet on this particular day, beneath the streets of Berlin, 33 feet below ground, in a concrete bunker designed to withstand the apocalypse, a woman named Magda Goebbels moved through rooms thick with dust and diesel fumes. The Soviet artillery had been pounding the city for days, each explosion sending tremors through reinforced walls, dislodging particles of concrete that hung in the artificial light like snow that would never melt. She had 6 children. Their names were Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Holder, Hedda, and Heide. The eldest was 12 years old. The youngest had just turned 4. These children had grown up in the inner circle of Nazi power, playing in gardens, while their father orchestrated propaganda that sent millions to their deaths. They knew nothing else. The regime was their entire world. What runs through a mother's mind in such moments? We cannot know with certainty, but we know what she did. The historical record is brutally clear. One by one, she crushed cyanide capsules between her children's teeth. The poison worked quickly, as poisons designed for such purposes do. Within minutes, the future generation of what their parents called the master race lay silent in their bunker beds, dressed in their nightclothes, their small bodies still. The Reich that was meant to span centuries ended for them before they could understand what a Reich even was. Just 20 miles to the south, another woman faced a different arithmetic of ending. Emmy Goering had spent the war years in a hunting lodge called Karinhall, a palace so vast it required 200 rooms to contain its magnificence. Imagine such a place. The Great Hall alone could host 300 guests for dinner. The walls displayed paintings by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Rubens. Each artwork had a history, though not the history recorded in the gilt-edged catalogues Emmy kept in her library. These were treasures seized from murdered families across Europe, plucked from homes where they had hung for generations, redirected to decorate the walls of those who orchestrated the murders. Her husband Hermann had been the second most powerful man in Germany, the Reichsmarschall who commanded the Luftwaffe and controlled an empire built on systematic plunder. Now American tanks rolled toward Berchtesgaden, and Emmy faced a problem of a practical nature. How does one compress a life of unimaginable wealth into what can be carried in flight? She chose diamonds. Specifically, she removed them from their settings and packed them into her daughter's teddy bear, stitching the fabric closed with thread that had once embroidered swastikas onto dress uniforms. Her daughter Edda, just 7 years old, clutched that bear as they fled, unaware she carried a fortune in gems pressed against her chest. The child thought she was saving a toy. She was actually transporting the condensed plunder of a continent. These two scenes, unfolding simultaneously across a landscape being carved into occupation zones by advancing Allied armies, represent something larger than individual tragedy or justice. They mark a moment of transformation so complete that it would reshape not just Germany, but our understanding of complicity, guilt, and the mechanics of denial that allow ordinary humans to participate in extraordinary evil. The transformation was happening everywhere, all at once. 20 miles to the east of the bunker, Margaret Himmler stood in her kitchen, feeding photograph albums into the cast-iron stove. Consider what those albums contained. Images of garden parties where her husband Heinrich discussed the logistics of genocide over afternoon tea. Photographs of family holidays at estates confiscated from Jewish families who had already been transported eastward. Pictures of Christmas celebrations in 1943, 1944. The children opening presents while trains rolled toward camps where other children would never see another Christmas. The photographs curled and blackened in the flames. Emulsion bubbling, faces disappearing into ash. But photographs are merely copies. The events they documented had already burned themselves into history with a permanence no fire could touch. Margaret burned evidence, but she could not burn facts. In a small apartment in Munich, Ilse Hess received word that would alter the trajectory of her entire existence. Her husband Rudolf had been Adolf Hitler's deputy, the man who transcribed Mein Kampf from Hitler's dictation, while both men served prison sentences for attempting to overthrow the German government in 1923. But in 1941, Rudolf Hess had done something extraordinary and inexplicable. He had flown alone to Scotland in a desperate, delusional attempt to negotiate peace with Britain. He parachuted into a field, was immediately captured, and spent the rest of the war in British custody, while Nazi propaganda claimed he had gone mad. Now Ilse learned what this meant for her. Her husband's solo peace mission had failed so spectacularly that it became legend. But it also meant he would face Allied justice, and she would face the consequences of being married to a man who had helped build the regime, even if he had abandoned it in its middle years. The legal machinery grinding toward judgment made no distinction between those who stayed loyal until the end and those who fled before the conclusion. Complicity was complicity, whether maintained for 12 years or for 8. In Vienna, something remarkable was occurring that would only become clear decades later. The wives of 73 SS officers gathered in an apartment building that had once housed a Jewish textile merchant and his family. The merchant and his wife had been deported to Auschwitz in 1942. Their teenage daughters had been sent to Ravensbrück. None survived. Now SS wives sat in rooms where Jewish children had once studied Hebrew and practiced piano, dividing resources for escape. They worked with the efficiency their husbands had brought to other forms of organization. Gold coins were distributed according to a formula based on rank and perceived need. Forged papers, stamped with the seal of the International Red Cross, were passed from hand to hand. Each woman memorized a new identity, new name, new birthplace, new personal history. The details mattered enormously. A story that placed you in Dresden during the firebombing provided an explanation for why no records existed. A claim to have been bombed out of Cologne explained missing documentation. The geography of destruction became the geography of reinvention. By dawn, they would scatter. Some would head south toward Italy, where networks through Catholic monasteries could move fugitives toward ships bound for South America. Others would attempt to disappear into the chaos of displaced persons camps, where millions of genuine refugees created a human sea in which individuals could vanish. A few would try for Switzerland, where neutrality meant something different than justice, and where banks asked few questions about deposits made by Germans with ready cash. What's striking about these preparations is their speed. The meeting in Vienna occurred within 72 hours of Hitler's suicide. The networks these women activated had been prepared in advance. This was not panic. This was procedure. Somewhere, someone had planned for this possibility. Contingencies had been established. Safe houses had been arranged. Contacts had been cultivated. The infrastructure of escape existed before the need for escape became apparent. This tells us something uncomfortable about belief. We might imagine that true believers in the 1,000-year Reich would have been shocked by its collapse, paralyzed by the gap between prophecy and reality. But the preparation of escape networks in 1944, when defeat became mathematically certain, though not yet publicly acknowledged, reveals a different truth. At some level, Even those who shouted the loudest about eternal victory understood that empires built on murder contain the seeds of their own destruction. The question that haunts these hours is one of knowledge. What did these women know? When did they know it? And how did knowing, or deliberately not knowing, shape their choices in these final days? Emmy Goering would later claim she believed the art collection had been legally purchased. The fact that paintings arrived at Harrenhal with museum identification plates still attached, that bills of sale were often dated after the original owners had been deported, that entire collections appeared within weeks of Jewish families disappearing from their homes. These details she claimed not to notice. She lived surrounded by beauty, stolen from the murdered, and maintained she saw nothing suspicious. Magda Goebbels knew exactly what she was doing in the bunker. She had chosen death for her children deliberately, explaining in a letter written the day before that she could not imagine them living in a world without National Socialism. This was not ignorance. This was ideology so complete it erased the possibility of future adaptation. Her children died not because she wanted to spare them suffering, but because she could not conceive of them existing outside the system she and her husband had helped build. The transformation from power to powerlessness occurred with stunning velocity. On April 1st, 1945, these women commanded servants in marble halls. They hosted diplomatic receptions where champagne flowed and orchestras played, while beyond the walls, millions starved in occupied territories, stripped of food to feed German cities. They wore furs and jewels and dresses cut from fabric that should have clothed prisoners shivering in unheated barracks. 30 days later, everything had changed. Emmy Goering was packing diamonds into a teddy bear. Margaret Himmler was burning photographs. The Vienna wives were memorizing lies that would become their new truths. The velocity of collapse was itself remarkable. Empires usually fall slowly, crumbling over generations. The Third Reich collapsed in weeks, the facade of invincibility shattering so quickly that those who had lived within it had no time to adjust their understanding before finding themselves fugitives from a justice they had never imagined would arrive, and it was arriving from every direction. Soviet forces pushed from the east, their advance marked by artillery bombardments that reduced cities to rubble. American forces drove from the west and south, their methodical progress accompanied by photographers documenting every camp they liberated, every mass grave they uncovered. British forces moved through northern Germany, their intelligence services already compiling lists of who would face trial. French forces occupied southwestern regions, their soldiers having not forgotten 4 years of occupation and the deportation of French Jews to German death camps. The women caught in this converging vice faced choices measured in hours: stay and face judgment, or flee and face uncertainty. Both options carried profound risks. Those who stayed might be imprisoned, tried, executed. Those who fled might be caught anyway, or might successfully disappear, but spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders, wondering when the past would catch up. As night fell on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler's body burned in a shell crater outside the bunker, while Magda Goebbels' children lay dead inside. Emmy Goering's car moved through darkness toward the Swiss border. Margaret Himmler locked her door and prepared to tell Allied interrogators she had no idea what her husband did for a living. The Vienna wives scattered into a night full of checkpoints and patrols, and borders that shifted by the hour as armies reorganized, conquered. Territory, the Reich that promised to last 1,000 years, had lasted exactly 12 years and 3 months. In that brief span, it had murdered 11 million people in camps, killed 27 million Soviet citizens through warfare and starvation, destroyed entire communities, and built an architecture of evil so systematic it required specialized vocabulary to describe. The Nazis kept meticulous records of their crimes, documenting murders with the same bureaucratic precision they applied to railway timetables and ammunition inventories. Now those records were being captured by advancing armies. Filing cabinets full of deportation orders, Ledgers listing property seized from Jewish families. Photographs taken by SS officers of mass executions, kept as souvenirs or filed as proof of duties performed. The paper trail of genocide was falling into the hands of those who would use it to construct cases for prosecution. And in the chaos of collapse, the wives were making calculations about what could be hidden, what could be denied, and what could be reimagined. The next months would determine not just their fates, but establish patterns that would echo through every genocide that followed, every fall of every murderous regime, every moment when perpetrators and their families faced the question of accountability. The power had crumbled. What came next would test whether justice could be extracted from the rubble. The human capacity for organization reveals itself most clearly in moments of crisis. Consider how ants respond to the destruction of their colony, how birds navigate during migration, how water finds paths through stone over centuries. Nature provides endless examples of systems that activate when survival demands coordination. In the aftermath of the Reich's collapse, networks emerged that had been carefully constructed in anticipation of exactly this necessity. Within 72 hours of Adolf Hitler's death, the escape networks came alive. These were not spontaneous arrangements cobbled together in panic. They were infrastructure, built deliberately during 1944 when certain individuals within the Nazi hierarchy performed calculations and reached uncomfortable conclusions. The mathematics of the Eastern Front told a story that propaganda could not obscure. The Allied advance from the West proceeded with industrial efficiency. Defeat was not yet certain in public discourse, but it was certain in the minds of those who understood logistics, production capacity, and the arithmetic of armies. So they prepared, and the preparations were remarkable in their scope and sophistication. Through monastery cellars in Austria, Catholic priests handed out baptismal certificates. These were not forgeries in the crude sense. They were genuine documents, created by genuine religious authorities, recording events that had never occurred. A baptism dated to 1935 could transform a devoted Nazi into a lifelong Catholic. The paper itself was authentic, only the history it recorded was fiction. The priests who participated in this system did so for complex reasons that historians still debate. Some genuinely believed in redemption, that even those complicit in great evil deserved a path to salvation. Others saw it as protection of anti-communist forces who might prove useful in the coming confrontation with Soviet atheism. Still others were paid, their spiritual services rendered in exchange for gold coins minted from wedding rings stolen from deportees. Motivation varied, but the result was consistent: new identities, blessed by holy water and recorded in church registries that Allied investigators would have no reason to doubt. The Vatican rat line stretched from Innsbruck to Genoa, a distance of approximately 430 miles through some of the most difficult terrain in Europe. The route had been mapped carefully. Every 50 kilometers, a safe house waited. Some were actual monasteries where fugitives could shelter in cells that had housed monks for centuries. Others were farms owned by sympathetic families who asked no questions when travelers arrived after dark and departed before dawn. A few were businesses, shops with back rooms and false walls, where a person could disappear for days while documents were prepared or checkpoints shifted position. Genoa represented the goal because Genoa meant ships. The Mediterranean port had been rebuilt quickly after the war's end, its strategic importance ensuring that Allied authorities invested in returning it to functional capacity. Ships bound for Argentina departed weekly. Argentina had maintained careful neutrality during the war, tilting toward the Axis powers without committing fully enough to face consequences. Now that neutrality paid dividends. Argentina welcomed European immigrants with few questions about their pasts, particularly if those immigrants arrived with capital to invest in Argentine businesses. The ship's cargo holds had been modified. Not obviously, not in ways that casual inspection would reveal, but where cargo normally sat, False floors created spaces large enough for humans to occupy during the multi-week voyage across the Atlantic. Ventilation was minimal, sanitation was primitive, the darkness was absolute, but the spaces existed, and they were used. Organization Odessa operated parallel to the church networks, but with different methods. Formed by SS intelligence officers who had spent the war years creating false identities for spies and coordinating resistance networks in occupied territories, Odessa applied those same skills to the problem of evacuation. The name itself is disputed by historians. Some claim it stood for Organisation der ehemaligen SS-Angehörigen, Organization of Former SS Members. Others say this is myth, that no such formal organization existed, only loose networks of former comrades helping each other escape. But whether formally organized or informally coordinated, the system functioned. Safe houses appeared every 50 kilometers along predetermined routes. The spacing was not arbitrary. 50 kilometers represented a night's travel on foot through difficult terrain, or an hour's drive by truck when roads were passable and checkpoints could be avoided. The safe houses were positioned to create overlapping zones of security where a fugitive was never more than a few hours from shelter. Henriette von Schirach's journey illustrates the brutal practicality of escape. She was the daughter of Hitler's personal photographer and the wife of Baldur von Schirach, who had served as Gauleiter of Vienna and leader of the Hitler Youth. Her husband had overseen the deportation of 65,000 Viennese Jews to death camps in Poland. She had lived in palaces furnished with art seized from murdered families. Now she traveled hidden beneath hay bales in a farm truck, bouncing along roads cratered by artillery fire. The journey covered 400 miles through zones controlled by American, Soviet, British, and French forces. Each zone maintained different search protocols, different priorities, different levels of vigilance about German refugees. The Americans focused on finding major war criminals whose names appeared on carefully compiled lists. The Soviets arrested anyone who looked useful for interrogation or labor. The British maintained thorough documentation but moved people through processing quickly. The French searched for those who had specifically committed crimes on French soil or against French citizens. Understanding these different approaches meant survival. A route that crossed from American to French zones at a lightly guarded rural border point was safer than attempting to pass through a major checkpoint where all four powers maintained joint surveillance. The networks maintained intelligence about checkpoint schedules, about which guards could be bribed, about which crossing points were being watched and which were ignored. Henriette carried her 8-year-old son through this landscape. The child had been drugged with phenobarbital, a sedative that induced deep sleep. This was not cruelty but calculation. A crying child at a checkpoint meant questions. A sleeping child aroused no suspicion. Farm families traveling with sleeping children were common in those chaotic months. Everyone was displaced, everyone was moving, and exhausted children slept through bumpy journeys in the backs of trucks. But there was cost. Henriette's diamonds, sewn into her corset for concealment, created bruises with every jolt of the truck's suspension. The gems pressed against ribs and hip bones, leaving marks that would take months to fade. This is what wealth became in collapse, not comfort, but hidden pressure against flesh, value that could only be accessed by accepting pain. The journey took 17 days. Consider what that means. 17 days of hiding in hay bales, sleeping in barns, moving only at night when darkness provided cover. 17 days of fear at every checkpoint, terror at every unexpected sound. 17 days of drugging her child repeatedly because a single moment of crying could mean capture. The distance between Vienna and the Swiss border could be driven in 5 hours on good roads with no obstacles. In the spring of 1945, it took 17 days of constant threat. At the Swiss border, the final transaction occurred. Swiss guards demanded payment for allowing unauthorized entry. The official rate was 10,000 Reichsmarks, but by May of 1945, Reich currency was worthless paper. Hyperinflation had destroyed whatever value remained. The guards knew this. Their demand for Reichsmarks was theatre, a performance that allowed them to appear to follow regulations while actually preparing to negotiate for something real. Henrietta offered gold, jewelry, small coins, anything of value she had managed to carry. The guards examined each piece, calculating weight and purity. In the end, they demanded something more direct. A single gold tooth pulled from her jaw. There was no anesthetic, no proper tools. In the barn outside Feldkirch, a town straddling the Austrian-Swiss border, someone produced pliers, the kind used for pulling nails from wood or twisting wire. Henriette opened her mouth, and someone who was not a dentist gripped one of her molars and pulled until the roots tore free from the bone. The pain must have been extraordinary, but pain passes. Capture meant imprisonment, trial, possible execution. She paid the price. The tooth, still bloody, was handed to the guards. They waved her through. Switzerland awaited, neutral and unconcerned, with questions about how refugees earned the wealth they carried. The mathematics of escape proved brutal when examined closely. Historians have attempted to compile comprehensive statistics, though the clandestine nature of these networks makes exact numbers impossible. The estimates suggest that of approximately 300 high-ranking Nazi wives, 112 attempted flight through organized networks. 43 reached South America, most settled in Argentina, particularly in Buenos Aires, and its suburbs where German communities had existed since the 19th century. A few went to Paraguay, which offered even fewer questions than Argentina. 2 made it to Bolivia, and somehow reached Chile, though the records of her journey remain obscure. 28 made it to Spain. Franco's Spain was sympathetic to former Axis members, having received Nazi support during the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish government offered residency to those who could demonstrate anti-communist credentials or who arrived with sufficient capital to invest in Spanish businesses. Some Nazi wives remained in Spain permanently. Others used it as a waypoint, waiting in Madrid or Barcelona until arrangements could be made for travel elsewhere. 16 disappeared into Swiss convents. Switzerland's neutrality extended to providing refuge for those who could pay, but some women chose deliberate obscurity over the risk of eventual discovery in secular society. The convents offered something valuable: erasure. Behind convent walls, previous identities became irrelevant. The sisters asked no questions about the past. The routines of religious life, prayer and labor and silence created a kind of amnesia where history could be forgotten in the repetition of ritual. The rest, the majority, faced capture. But capture meant wildly different fates depending on which Allied zone found them first. American zone prisoners underwent denazification proceedings, a legal process designed to categorize Germans into 5 types: major offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and exonerated. The wives occupied ambiguous legal territory. Were they perpetrators or merely married to perpetrators? Did wearing stolen jewelry constitute a war crime? Did living in homes seized from deported families make one complicit in deportation? Soviet zone prisoners faced harsher judgment. The Soviets had suffered 27 million dead during the war. Their desire for retribution was not abstract. Nazi wives captured by Soviet forces were typically sent to labor camps in the East, where they joined millions of other prisoners, building the infrastructure of Stalin's post-war expansion. Some returned years later. Some did not return at all. British zone authorities were methodical. They documented everything, creating vast files on each prisoner, but moved people through the system relatively quickly unless specific charges could be filed. The British approach was legalistic, focused on proving individual guilt rather than collective punishment. French zone treatment varied by location and circumstance. Those captured in areas where resistance fighters had been tortured or civilians massacred faced rough justice. Those taken in regions where the occupation had been less brutal encountered more measured responses. The French had lived under Nazi rule for 4 years and had their own complicated reckoning with collaboration and resistance. What emerges from examining these different fates is a picture of justice struggling to organize itself amid chaos. The Allies had anticipated many challenges of occupation, food distribution, disease prevention, infrastructure repair. But they had not fully anticipated the legal and moral complexity of processing millions of people whose guilt existed on a spectrum from direct perpetration to passive complicity to unwilling victimhood. The wives existed somewhere in that spectrum's middle ranges. They had not planned the Holocaust, but they had benefited from it. They had not operated the camps, but they had worn the jewelry stripped from deportees. They had not pulled triggers, but they had lived in comfort purchased with plunder. Where along the scale of culpability did such participation fall? The answer varied depending on who was asking. And so the fate of Nazi wives divided along the lines where their escapes ended. In South American cities where they could rebuild in immigrant communities. In Spanish towns where their past could be carefully obscured. In Swiss convents where history dissolved in prayer. Or in Allied custody where different occupying powers applied different standards of judgment to the same questions of guilt. The underground rivers that carried these women away from justice were marvels of organization, testimony to what humans can construct when survival demands coordination. But they were also monuments to a different human capacity, the ability to help those we consider our own, regardless of what our own have done. The priests and farmers and border guards who facilitated these escapes were not, for the most part, evil people. They were people who had decided that their obligation to help trumped questions about whether help was deserved. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the escape networks. They functioned because ordinary people made them function, one decision at a time, one hidden fugitive at a time, one falsified document at a time. The banality of evil that Hannah Arendt would later describe in her analysis of Adolf Eichmann's trial applied equally to the banality of escape. Neither genocide nor flight from its consequences required monsters. Both required only the steady accumulation of individual choices that, taken together, produced extraordinary outcomes. Justice is a concept we imagine as balanced scales, blind and impartial. But in practice, justice is a machine built by humans, and like all machines, it reflects the priorities and limitations of its builders. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the Allied powers constructed a machine for processing guilt on a scale never before attempted. 12 million Germans would pass through its mechanisms between 1945 and 1948. Each person sorted into categories that would determine their future. The denazification machine, as it came to be called, represented something unprecedented in human history. Previous wars had ended with executions of leaders and general amnesties for followers. But the Nazi regime's crimes were so systematic, so thoroughly documented, so vast in scope that simple categories of victor and vanquished seemed inadequate. The Allies decided that Germany itself needed to be examined person by person, each individual's role in the regime assessed and judged. The system divided Germans into 5 categories. Major offenders faced trial and potential execution. Offenders received prison sentences. Lesser offenders paid fines and faced employment restrictions. Followers endured monitoring but no punishment. The exonerated were declared free of guilt. Into one of these 5 boxes, every adult German was supposed to fit. The wives occupied a legal twilight zone that the categories struggled to contain. Consider Emmy Goering, who sat in Straubing prison while lawyers debated the nature of her guilt. Her husband, Hermann, had committed suicide by cyanide capsule hours before his scheduled execution at Nuremberg. He had been convicted on all 4 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and initiating wars of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. His guilt was established beyond any reasonable doubt. But what of his wife? Emmy possessed 137 paintings when Allied investigators catalogued the Goering properties. not reproductions or minor works, but masterpieces by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Rubens, Cranach, and dozens of other masters whose canvases represented the pinnacle of European artistic achievement. The collection's value in today's currency would exceed $4 billion. Each painting had a provenance, a history of ownership documented in records the Nazis themselves maintained with characteristic thoroughness. The paintings had belonged to Jewish families, the Rothschilds in Vienna, the Goudstickers in Amsterdam, the Schloss collection in Paris, the Gutmanns in Berlin. Each family had been forced to surrender their treasures under duress, then deported to camps where they were murdered. Museum identification plates remained attached to many of the frames. Small brass rectangles engraved with acquisition numbers and previous institutional owners. The plates had never been removed. They hung in Karenhall's galleries, 200 rooms of looted beauty, with the evidence of their theft literally screwed into their wooden frames. Emmy claimed ignorance. She testified that she believed her husband had purchased the paintings legally through art dealers and auction houses. When prosecutors pointed to the museum plates, she suggested that perhaps dealers had failed to remove them. When they showed her bills of sale, dated weeks after the original owners had been transported to Auschwitz, she expressed surprise. When they documented how entire collections arrived at Karenhall within days of Jewish families disappearing from their homes, she maintained she had noticed nothing suspicious. The question facing the court was whether this ignorance, even if genuine, constituted innocence. She had lived surrounded by stolen beauty. She had walked through galleries hung with paintings seized from the murdered. She had entertained guests in rooms decorated with treasures taken from people who were being systematically exterminated. If she truly had not known, was that willful blindness itself a form of guilt? The legal arguments consumed months. Defense lawyers argued that wives could not be held responsible for their husbands' crimes, that marriage did not constitute conspiracy, that possession of stolen property required knowledge that the property was stolen. Prosecutors countered that the scale and obviousness of the theft made ignorance implausible, that benefiting from genocide while claiming ignorance of genocide was a moral evasion that law should not permit. In Nuremberg's Palace of Justice, a building selected for its symbolic importance as the site where the Nuremberg laws had stripped Jews of citizenship in 1935, prosecutors presented evidence that would seem fantastic if not documented in the Nazis' own meticulous records. The regime had kept files on everything: transportation schedules for deportation trains, inventories of property seized from occupied territories, payroll records for camp guards, meeting minutes discussing the logistics of mass murder. The paper trail of genocide was complete. Among those documents were records that implicated the wives not merely as passive beneficiaries, but as active participants in specific crimes. Ilse Koch, known as the Witch of Buchenwald, collected lampshades made from tattooed human skin. This is not propaganda or exaggeration. American investigators found the lampshades in her home, analyzed them, and confirmed they were made from human skin bearing distinctive tattoos. Prisoners at Buchenwald testified that Koch would walk through the camp, identifying inmates with interesting tattoos, who would then be killed and their skin preserved. Her lawyer argued she had merely appreciated unusual artwork, that she had no knowledge of the material's origin, that the lampshades had been gifts whose provenance she never investigated. The court found this defense unconvincing. How does one receive lampshades made from human skin as gifts without asking questions? How does one hang such objects in one's home without noticing their disturbing characteristics? The court sentenced her to life imprisonment, though she would later be released early, then rearrested when additional evidence emerged. Finally dying by suicide in prison in 1967, Margaret Himmler claimed she never knew her husband's work involved more than what he described as resettlement programs. Heinrich Himmler had overseen the entire SS apparatus, the Gestapo, and the concentration camp system. He had been the primary architect of the Holocaust's implementation. Margaret had lived adjacent to Dachau concentration camp for 11 years. 11 years. Consider that time span. In 11 years, a child grows from infancy to the edge of adolescence. In 11 years, seasons cycle through 44 times. In 11 years, one has 4,000 mornings to wake and smell whatever wind carries from nearby. Margaret claimed she never noticed anything unusual, despite living close enough to Dachau to see its watchtowers from her garden. Former prisoners testified that the smell from the crematoriums was detectable for miles when winds shifted eastward, a sweet, sick odor that local residents learned to recognize. Margaret testified she might have noticed unpleasant smells on certain days, but assumed them to come from industrial facilities or agricultural operations. The court faced a philosophical problem disguised as a legal one. If wives claimed ignorance, how could prosecutors prove knowledge? The Nazi regime had operated through euphemism and misdirection even within its own ranks. Reinhard Heydrich's 1942 Wannsee Conference, where the Holocaust's implementation was formally coordinated, referred to murder as special treatment and genocide as the final solution to the Jewish question. If the regime itself used coded language, could wives be blamed for accepting official explanations? But the court also recognized that willful ignorance, the deliberate choice not to investigate suspicious circumstances, could itself constitute a form of guilt. Margaret Himmler had lived beside a concentration camp for 11 years, while her husband directed the camp system. She had attended social functions with other SS wives whose husbands ran camps across occupied Europe. At some point, the choice not to know became indistinguishable from the choice to accept. The court sentenced her to periods of imprisonment, though less than what major offenders received. The legal system had decided that being married to architects of genocide, benefiting from their crimes, and maintaining deliberate ignorance of their actions constituted guilt, but guilt of a lesser category than direct perpetration. The American zone implemented Law No. 8, which addressed a practical question: what happens to Nazi property? The Reich had built its wealth through systematic plunder, so property owned by high-ranking Nazis was presumptively stolen. Law No. 8 declared that Nazi property becomes state property, available for redistribution or compensation to victims. Emmy Goering lost everything. The Karinhall hunting lodge, 200 rooms of grandeur built with forced labor using materials seized from conquered territories, became state property and was eventually demolished. The art collection, 137 masterpieces stolen from murdered families, was returned to heirs when they could be located or transferred to museums as orphaned works when entire families had been exterminated with no surviving relatives to claim inheritance. She lost jewelry, furniture, clothing, household items. The fine china from which she had served dinner to foreign dignitaries was confiscated. The crystal glasses from which she had toasted the Reich's victories were packed into crates. Even her wedding ring was taken because it contained gold allocated from SS reserves. Gold that had been melted down from jewelry seized from deportees. Emmy Goering emerged from Straubing prison in 1947 with 1 suitcase and 20 Deutsche Marks. In the new currency that had replaced the worthless Reichsmark, 20 marks represented approximately $5, enough for 3 days of basic food if spent carefully. She was 54 years old, and everything she had possessed had been deemed the proceeds of crime. The transformation was total. From a woman who had commanded servants, entertained foreign ministers, and worn jewels worth fortunes to a woman with 1 suitcase and lunch money. The speed of this reversal illustrates something about wealth built on injustice. It evaporates the moment its foundations are examined. Other wives faced different calculations of justice. Those whose husbands had occupied lower ranks in the hierarchy or who had operated in areas where documentation was less complete often received lesser punishments. The denazification machine processed people at industrial speed, 300,000 cases per month at its peak, and such volume meant that thoroughness was impossible. Many slipped through with minimal punishment because prosecutors lacked time to build comprehensive cases against everyone. The disparity in outcomes troubled observers even at the time. Why should Emmy Goering serve years in prison, while other wives, whose husbands had committed comparable crimes, received fines and monitoring? The answer involved evidence. Hermann Goering's crimes were extensively documented. Other Nazi officials had been more cautious about creating paper trails, or their records had been destroyed during the war's final chaos. Justice required proof, and proof required documents, and documents existed in varying completeness depending on individual circumstances. This randomness of documentation created randomness in punishment. Two women whose husbands had held similar ranks and committed similar crimes might face vastly different outcomes because one husband had kept meticulous records while the other had not. The arbitrariness troubled anyone who believed justice should be consistent. But consistency was impossible given the volume of cases and the scattered nature of evidence. The legal proceedings also revealed uncomfortable truths about Allied priorities. The Americans focused intensively on high-profile cases that could be well documented and publicized. The Nuremberg trials received extensive press coverage, serving purposes beyond individual justice. They educated the world about Nazi crimes and established precedents for international law. But this focus on major cases meant that lesser figures often received less scrutiny. The British pursued a different approach, prioritizing completeness over publicity. They processed cases methodically but quietly, creating enormous archives that would prove valuable to historians decades later but generated fewer headlines contemporaneously. The British seemed less interested in dramatic trials than in thorough documentation of what had occurred. The Soviets pursued retribution more than rehabilitation. Their zone saw harsher sentences, more executions, more deportations to labor camps. The Soviet Union had suffered catastrophic losses during the war, entire cities destroyed, tens of millions dead, and their approach to German prisoners reflected that suffering. Soviet justice was not blind. It remembered the French faced their own complications. France had been occupied, but France had also produced collaborators. The Vichy government had actively cooperated with Nazi deportation programs. French police had rounded up Jewish families for transport to German camps. Processing Nazi wives raised uncomfortable questions about French complicity that many preferred not to examine too closely. Into this complex landscape of varying standards and different priorities, the Nazi wives navigated as best they could. Those with skilled lawyers received better outcomes. Those who could demonstrate they had opposed their husbands' actions, or at least maintained distance from them, received more lenient treatment. Those who expressed remorse were treated more favorably than those who remained defiant. But remorse itself became performative. How could judges distinguish genuine regret from strategic contrition designed to reduce sentences? When Emmy Goering wept during testimony, were those tears of genuine sorrow for victims or self-pity at her own downfall? The internal states of defendants remained inaccessible to external judgment, so courts could only evaluate behavior and statements, knowing that both could be calculated for effect. The years between 1945 and 1948 saw 12 million Germans processed through denazification proceedings. Of those millions, the wives of high-ranking Nazis numbered in the hundreds, a tiny fraction of the total. But their cases received disproportionate attention because they embodied questions about complicity, benefit, and guilt that extended beyond individual actions to systemic participation. What responsibility does one bear for enjoying the benefits of crimes one did not personally commit? When does living in luxury purchased with plunder become itself a form of theft? How much must one know before ignorance becomes implausible? These questions had no easy answers, but they demanded answers nonetheless because ignoring them meant accepting that proximity to evil, without direct perpetration, carried no moral weight. The scales of justice attempted to measure these immeasurable things, to quantify the unquantifiable, to assign numerical sentences to crimes that existed in realms beyond mathematics. Sometimes the scales produced outcomes that seemed fair. Sometimes they produced outcomes that seemed arbitrary. Often they produced outcomes that simply reflected the practical limitations of processing millions of people through legal systems designed for far smaller volumes. What emerged from this massive effort was not perfect justice, but approximate justice. Justice that acknowledged its own limitations while insisting that some accountability was better than none. The Nazi wives who faced these scales learned that their husband's guilt would stain them. But the depth of that stain would vary depending on evidence, on which zone captured them, on the quality of their legal defense, and on the particular judge who heard their case. The machine of justice ground on, imperfect but relentless, transforming women who had lived in palaces into women with prison sentences, or women with suitcases containing everything they now owned, sorted into categories that would follow them for the rest of their lives. In nature, metamorphosis occurs through biological programming. A caterpillar becomes a butterfly following instructions written into its genetic code millions of years ago. The transformation is automatic, inevitable, requiring no conscious decision. But humans possess a different kind of metamorphosis, one that requires deliberate choice and careful construction. In the displacement camps where 2 million Germans waited for processing in the years following the war, a different kind of transformation began. The camps were not prisons, though they resembled prisons. They were not quite refugee facilities, though they housed refugees. They existed in a category of their own, holding areas where people waited while bureaucracies determined their fates. Some camps were former military barracks. Others were hastily constructed wooden buildings on muddy fields. A few occupied the very concentration camps they had helped operate, an irony that escaped no one who noticed. Into these camps came the Nazi wives who had not escaped, who had been captured or surrendered, who had completed prison sentences or been processed through denazification hearings. They arrived with whatever they had managed to carry or retain through confiscation. They emerged, eventually, as different people. The transformation began with names. Names carry history. Emmy Goering could not become someone else while keeping that surname, which appeared in newspapers worldwide attached to accounts of looted art and war crimes trials. Margaret Himmler's name connected her immediately to the architect of the Holocaust. Hilde Hess remained married to a man imprisoned in Spandau prison for life, making her name a permanent marker of Nazi association. But in the chaos of displacement, where millions of people moved through Europe with inadequate documentation, names became fluid. Official records had been destroyed by bombing, burned during retreat, or simply lost in administrative confusion. A woman could claim a new name, a new birthplace, a new personal history, and who could definitively prove otherwise? Gertrude Schultz-Klink's transformation exemplifies the process. She had commanded the Nazi Women's League, an organization of 8 million German women dedicated to promoting Nazi ideology through social programs, education, and cultural events. She had given speeches to crowds of thousands, met personally with Hitler dozens of times, and wielded influence that made her one of the most powerful women in the Reich. Her face had appeared in newspapers and newsreels throughout the Nazi years. She became Maria Stuckerbrock. The creation of Maria Stuckerbrock required more than simply using a false name. It required constructing an entire biography that could withstand casual investigation. Maria Stuckerbrock was a war widow from Breslau, which was fortunate because Breslau now belonged to Poland, and German records there were inaccessible. Her husband had been killed on the Eastern Front in 1943. She had no children. She'd worked as a seamstress before the war, then in a munitions factory during it. She had never been political, never joined any Nazi organizations, simply tried to survive while forces beyond her control destroyed the world she knew. This biography contained strategic elements that repelled investigation. A husband killed on the Eastern Front meant no one could interview him to verify details. No children meant no young witnesses whose memories might contradict the story. Work in a factory placed her among millions of other women who had done similar work, creating no distinguishing features. Political uninvolvement meant no paper trail through party organizations. Gertrude Schultz-Klink lived as Maria Stuckerbrock for 23 years. She sold homemade soap at markets, did laundry for families, maintained a tiny apartment in a working-class neighborhood. She spoke quietly, drew no attention, existed as one anonymous face among millions of anonymous faces in post-war. Germany's struggling recovery, the disguise finally, failed in 1967 when a journalist named Peter Dudek recognized her in a bakery, Q in Bebra, not from recent appearance, because she had aged and deliberately changed her look, but from her distinctive Habsburg jaw, a genetic trait that no amount of weight change or hair dye could alter. Dudek had studied photographs from the 1930s and recognized that particular bone structure. He followed her home, confirmed his suspicion through surveillance, and published an exposé that ended Maria Stuckerbrock's existence and returned Gertrude Schultz-Klink to public accounting. Her case revealed how transformation worked for those who succeeded at it. The engineering of new identity required precise calibration between change and continuity. Too much change attracted attention in a society where dramatic personal reinvention raised suspicions. A woman in her 50s who suddenly claimed to be 30 would be questioned. Someone who moved from Bavaria to Berlin without explanation might trigger investigation, but too little change risked recognition. Keeping one's natural hair color, maintaining previous social circles, or residing in the same region where one was known created vulnerabilities. The successful transformations existed in a careful middle ground. Enough change to frustrate recognition, but not so much change as to seem implausible. Henriette Hoffmann understood this calculus. She was Hitler's personal photographer's daughter, had grown up within the Nazi inner circle and married Baldur von Schirach when she was 19. Her husband had led the Hitler Youth before becoming Gauleiter of Vienna, overseeing the deportation of 65,000 Viennese Jews. She had lived in palaces, worn designer dresses, attended state functions where she rubbed shoulders with the Reich's leadership. Her transformation required multiple elements. She dyed her distinctive auburn hair black, a change dramatic enough to alter her appearance significantly. She gained 30 pounds by eating American relief rations, which were freely available to German civilians in the years immediately after the war. The weight gain changed her face shape, softening the angular features that had been photographed extensively during the Nazi years. She affected a Bavarian accent to mask her trained Vienna conservatory voice. This required practice. Henrietta had studied music seriously, her voice trained in techniques of projection and clarity that marked her as educated and privileged. The Bavarian accent, common among working-class Germans, suggested rural origins and limited education. She practiced until it became automatic, until she could maintain it even when startled or stressed. She found work in a Munich laundry, an occupation that completed her disguise. Her hands, which had once played Mozart for Hitler during private gatherings at the Berghof, became cracked and bleeding from industrial lye. The chemicals used in commercial laundries were harsh, designed to clean heavily soiled linens at scale rather than protect workers' skin. Within weeks, her pianist's hands were indistinguishable from those of any other laundry worker. The physical transformation was painful, but it was effective. A woman with black hair, 30 pounds heavier, speaking Bavarian dialect and working in a laundry bore little resemblance to the refined young woman who had moved through Nazi high society. The disguise worked until it no longer needed to work, until enough years had passed that most people had forgotten who Henrietta Hoffmann had been. Children complicated everything. They could serve as shields, making a woman seem more sympathetic, more focused on maternal concerns than political history. But they also created vulnerability because children remembered, and children asked questions, and children could accidentally reveal. Information that destroyed, carefully constructed. Lies. Gudrun Himmler was 12 years old when her father Heinrich committed suicide by cyanide capsule after being captured by British forces. The guards had been searching him when he bit down on the capsule hidden in his mouth. Death came within minutes, depriving the Allies of the opportunity to try the architect of the Holocaust alongside other Nazi leaders at Nuremberg. Gudrun kept her father's suicide note hidden in her shoe for 40 years. The paper, folded small and wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, moved with her through displacement camps, through Allied interrogations, through her teenage years, and into adulthood. She never told her mother it existed. She never showed it to authorities. It was her secret connection to a father she had adored, a man who had seemed loving and kind in her childhood memories, who had taken her to visit concentration camps where she remembered seeing prisoners who looked thin, but whom her father assured her were being well cared for. In 1960, Gudrun founded an organization called Stille Hilfe, Silent Help. Officially, it provided humanitarian assistance to Germans who had suffered during the war. In practice, it funneled money to convicted war criminals' families, paid for legal appeals, and supported those who continued to deny Nazi crimes. The funding came from Swiss bank accounts established before the war's end using gold extracted from victims' teeth, melted down and deposited in accounts that asked no questions about origin. By the late 1960s, Silent Help supported 800 families. The amounts varied based on need and the prominence of the imprisoned war criminal. Widows of executed SS officers received monthly payments sufficient to live modestly. Children of imprisoned guards received educational stipends. Legal fees for appeals were paid in full. The organization operated quietly, accepting donations from aging Nazis and their sympathizers, maintaining records that would not become public until decades later, when investigators finally gained access to the files. Gudrun never expressed regret for her father's actions. She maintained until her death in 2018 that he had been unfairly maligned, that he had only followed orders, that the full scope of his crimes was exaggerated by victors writing history. She wore a necklace with a pendant containing his photograph. She kept his letters in a specially made box. She referred to him as Papa in interviews, her voice softening when speaking his name, as though discussing a beloved parent rather than the man who oversaw the murder of 6 million Jews. Her devotion illustrates something troubling about transformation. While some Nazi wives created new identities to escape their pasts, others transformed by embracing their pasts more completely, by rejecting the verdict of history and constructing alternative narratives where their families had been persecuted rather than persecutors. Both approaches constituted metamorphosis, but metamorphosis toward opposite destinations. The camps themselves functioned as chrysalises, spaces where transformation occurred hidden from outside observation. Within their boundaries, women who had commanded servants learned to stand in queues for food rations. Those who had worn furs and jewels wore donated clothing from charity organizations. The physical markers of their previous status disappeared, replaced by the anonymous poverty of displacement. But internal transformation proved more complex. Could one change identity without changing understanding? Many Nazi wives adopted new names and new histories while maintaining their fundamental beliefs about the regime they had served. They became different people externally while remaining the same people internally, their metamorphosis limited to surface adaptations rather than deeper change. Others experienced something more profound. The confrontation with evidence of their husbands' crimes, the testimonies of survivors, the photographs from liberated camps, the meticulous records the Nazis themselves had kept. All of this created cognitive dissonance that some resolved through genuine transformation of understanding. They had believed they lived in a regime that, however harsh, served necessary purposes. The evidence revealed they had lived in a regime that industrialized murder, the Psychological literature on cognitive dissonance suggests that humans respond to contradictory information through various strategies. Some reject the new information to preserve existing beliefs. Others modify beliefs to accommodate new information. Still others compartmentalize, maintaining contradictory beliefs simultaneously by refusing to examine them together. Nazi wives employed all three strategies. Some, like Gudrun Himmler, rejected evidence of their family members' crimes as propaganda. Others acknowledged crimes but minimized their family members' roles, claiming they had been minor participants in systems they did not control. A few underwent complete transformations of understanding, accepting that they had been complicit in evil and attempting to atone through post-war activism or public testimony. The displacement camps, chaotic and uncomfortable as they were, provided space for these internal processes to unfold. Separated from the structures that had defined their previous lives, stripped of material wealth and social status, the wives faced questions about identity that went beyond names and addresses. Who were they when removed from context? What remained when everything external was taken away? Some discovered they were capable of resilience, of adapting to diminished circumstances and finding meaning in simple survival. Emmy Goering, who had lived in castles, learned to repair her own clothing and cook simple meals on a camp stove. The skills seemed trivial compared to her previous life, but they represented a form of competence that her previous dependence on servants had never required. Others discovered they were defined entirely by their previous status, unable to function without the structures that had elevated them. These women struggled in the camps, unable to adapt, clinging to memories of better times and anticipating restoration of their previous circumstances that would never occur. Some died in the camps, not from deliberate mistreatment, but from inability to adjust to the reality that the world they had known was permanently gone. The metamorphosis happened at different speeds for different women. Some transformed quickly, adopting new identities within months and moving forward into new lives. Others remained trapped between identities for years, unable to fully release their pasts, but also unable to fully embrace them. A few never transformed at all, maintaining until death that they remained who they had always been, that their names and histories were unchangeable, regardless of what authorities demanded. What unified these varied experiences was the recognition that transformation was necessary for survival. Whether that transformation was genuine or performative, deep or superficial, complete or partial, it was required. The world after 1945 had no place for unreconstructed Nazi wives who insisted on maintaining their previous identities. They could transform, or they could be crushed by the machinery of denazification. Most chose transformation. The camps eventually emptied as processing concluded and people moved into permanent housing in the new Germany being constructed from ruins. The women who emerged were not the women who had entered. They carried new names, new documents, new official histories. Whether they carried new understanding varied individually, invisible to external observation, but profoundly consequential for how they would live the decades remaining to them. Secrets have weight. They press against those who carry them, creating psychological pressure that accumulates over time. In physics, we understand that systems under pressure eventually find release through whatever crack or weakness exists in their containment. Human systems operate similarly. The Nazi wives' network of secrets, carefully maintained through the 1950s, began developing cracks as the 1960s progressed. October 15th, 1959. A date that seemed ordinary until a package arrived at the Frankfurt prosecutor's office. The package contained no return address, only a postmark from Buenos Aires. Inside were photographs from a wedding celebration, the images grainy but clear enough to distinguish faces. The bride was Erika Goering, Emmy's daughter. The guests were German expatriates living in Argentina, their faces showing the comfortable satisfaction of people who had successfully rebuilt lives far from the ruins of Europe. But one face in the photographs triggered immediate recognition. A man signing the wedding register, his profile captured as he bent to write his name. The signature itself was illegible in the photograph, but the face was not. Facial recognition was not yet computerized in 1959, but prosecutors maintained extensive files of photographs from the Nazi era. Within hours of examining the wedding photos, investigators made a match that would reverberate globally. The man was Adolf Eichmann, who had coordinated the logistics of the Holocaust, who had organized train schedules that transported millions to death camps, who had attended the Wannsee Conference, where the final solutions implementation was planned. Adolf Eichmann, who had supposedly died in 1945 during the chaos of Berlin's fall. Adolf Eichmann, who stood smiling at a wedding in Buenos Aires in 1959, very much alive, very much free. The revelation triggered Operation Archive, a systematic hunt for Nazi fugitives that would expose the wives' hidden networks with unprecedented thoroughness. If Eichmann lived in Argentina under an assumed name, who else had escaped? What networks had facilitated these escapes? And who was maintaining them? The investigation began with the wedding itself. Who had organized it? How had Erika Goering, living in Argentina, maintained contact with one of the most wanted war criminals in history? The answers revealed a web of connections that had operated continuously since 1945, a network so extensive it suggested institutional organization rather than loose associations of former comrades. Simon Wiesenthal's documentation center in Vienna became central to unraveling these networks. Wiesenthal, a Holocaust survivor who had lost 89 family members to the camps, had dedicated his post-war life to hunting Nazi war criminals. His center maintained files on 16,000 suspected war criminals and their families, accumulated through painstaking research that combined survivor testimonies, captured Nazi documents, and investigative work across multiple continents. Wiesenthal's investigators made a discovery that seemed almost fantastical. Nazi wives were communicating through coded, classified advertisements in German newspapers, not secret publications but mainstream newspapers with wide circulation. Their classified sections containing messages that appeared innocent to casual readers but carried specific meanings to those who knew the code. Alpine flowers seek gardener meant a safe house was available. The location was indicated by the newspaper's region of publication. A classified ad in a Munich paper meant Bavaria. A Frankfurt paper meant Hessen. The specific wording variations indicated the type of assistance available. Experienced gardener preferred meant the safe house could accommodate someone with significant baggage, either literal or metaphorical. Piano lessons for beginners signaled need for forged documents. Again, location mattered. The city where the ad appeared indicated where documents could be obtained. Advanced students, also welcome, meant multiple documents could be produced. Reasonable rates suggested the forger was trusted and established rather than new and risky. Seeking companionship for cultural activities indicated someone needed to disappear temporarily while authorities focused elsewhere. Theater and museums preferred meant urban hiding. Nature walks and quiet evenings suggested rural concealment. The code system operated continuously from 1945 to 1972, when Wiesenthal publicly exposed it through a press conference that made front-page news across Europe. During those 27 years, thousands of classified ads had circulated these coded messages. Researchers eventually compiled them, creating a database that revealed the scope of the network's operations. The ads appeared most frequently during periods when war crimes investigations intensified. When prosecutors announced new trials or when witnesses came forward with testimony about specific crimes, classified ads would spike in newspapers near where the accused had last been known to live. The pattern was clear. The network activated when members needed assistance evading justice. But who placed these ads? Who maintained the code? Who organized the responses? Investigation revealed that many ads were placed by women, often using maiden names or deceased relatives' names to avoid association with their Nazi-era identities. The wives had become the network's infrastructure, the connective tissue that held the fugitive community together across continents and decades. The reckoning arrived through unexpected channels. Beate Klarsfeld had been born in Berlin in 1939, meaning she had no adult memories of the Nazi period. She grew up in post-war Germany, accepting the official narrative that the Reich was a terrible chapter that had ended, that justice had been served, that the nation had moved forward. Then she married Serge Klarsfeld, a French Jew whose father had been deported to Auschwitz and murdered. Her husband's family history confronted her with questions she had never asked. What had happened to create such catastrophe? Who had been responsible? And what had happened to those responsible after the war ended? Her investigation revealed something that shocked her. Thousands of Nazi wives were receiving government pensions as war widows, despite their husbands' executions for war crimes. The pension system, established to support German women whose husbands had died in military service, had been interpreted broadly enough to include women whose husbands had been executed by Allied authorities. The logic was bureaucratic. A dead husband was a dead husband, regardless of how death occurred. But the moral implications were stunning. Women whose husbands had committed documented atrocities were receiving monthly government payments funded by German taxpayers, including Jewish survivors who had returned to Germany after the war. Emmy Goering received a pension. So did dozens of other women whose husbands had been executed at Nuremberg or died by suicide while awaiting trial. The amounts were modest by standards of their previous wealth, but they were regular and reliable. A woman who had lost everything through denazification could nevertheless depend on a monthly check that provided basic living expenses. Beate Klarsfeld's protests grew increasingly public through the late 1960s. She gave speeches, organized demonstrations, and confronted politicians with documentation of how the pension system was being applied. Her activism embarrassed the German government, which had been attempting to present itself as having thoroughly addressed its Nazi past. The revelation that war criminals' widows were receiving government support suggested otherwise. In 1968, the government passed new legislation requiring pension applicants to prove their husbands died in honorable service. The definition of honorable service explicitly excluded those executed for war crimes or crimes against humanity. The law applied retroactively, meaning women currently receiving pensions would be reassessed. Overnight, 4,300 women lost their income. The number itself was revealing. More than 4,000 German women had been receiving war widow pensions for husbands who did not die honorably. The scale suggested that the practice had been widespread, that bureaucrats had been approving these pensions routinely without investigating the circumstances of death beyond confirming that death had occurred. The loss of income created hardship for some, but it also created anger. Many of these women believed they had done nothing wrong, that they were being punished for their husbands' actions rather than their own. They formed advocacy groups arguing that wives should not be held responsible for their husbands' crimes, that marriage did not constitute moral or legal complicity, that taking away pensions amounted to collective punishment. The debate revealed fundamental disagreements about responsibility and complicity. Did benefiting from crimes create obligation, even if one had not committed the crimes oneself? Should those who lived in luxury purchased with plunder forfeit claims to government support after that luxury was removed? Was there a statute of limitations on guilt by association? These were not abstract philosophical questions. They determined whether elderly women would live in poverty or receive modest but adequate support. The answers varied depending on who was asking. Holocaust survivors generally believed that war criminals' widows deserved no government support. Many ordinary Germans felt sympathy for elderly women losing income regardless of their husbands' crimes. Politicians navigated between moral principle and electoral calculation. The pension controversy also exposed how many Nazi wives remained in Germany under their own names. The assumption had been that most would have fled or adopted false identities. But the 4,000 women whose pensions were revoked had been living openly, applying for government benefits using their legal married names. They had calculated correctly until 1968 that enough time had passed for their associations to become irrelevant. But time had not erased memory for everyone. Holocaust survivors remembered. Their children remembered. And a new generation of Germans, born after the war and educated about Nazi crimes in schools that had not existed during the Nazi era, remembered what had been done in their nation's name and wanted accounting. The exposure of the classified ad code and the pension controversy were merely the most visible elements of a broader phenomenon. Secrets were surfacing everywhere as archives opened, as survivors published memoirs, as journalists investigated stories that had been ignored during the immediate post-war focus on reconstruction. In 1961, Israel captured Adolf Eichmann in Buenos Aires and brought him to trial in Jerusalem. The trial was televised globally, bringing testimony from Holocaust survivors directly into living rooms across the world. The testimonies were devastating, describing in detail what the Nazi regime had done in camps and ghettos across occupied Europe. Viewers who had been children during the war, or who had chosen not to confront difficult truths during the 1950s, now faced evidence that could not be dismissed or ignored. The Eichmann trial created ripple effects throughout the network of Nazi fugitives and their families. If Eichmann could be captured in Argentina, no hiding place was truly safe. The trial also revealed how he had escaped through the Vatican rat line with assistance from Catholic clergy and using documents provided by the International Red Cross under a false identity. The revelation embarrassed both institutions and prompted internal investigations into who had helped Nazis escape and why. Following Eichmann's capture and execution, other fugitives became more cautious. Some moved from Argentina to Paraguay or Bolivia, seeking even more remote locations. Others underwent additional transformations of identity, adopting new names, even though they were already living under assumed identities. The paranoia this created within the fugitive community was corrosive. If Eichmann could be found, anyone could be found. Trust became difficult when anyone might be an informant or investigator. The wives maintaining the networks faced increasing risk. Placing coded classified ads required visiting newspaper offices or using mail services that could be traced. Maintaining safe houses meant property ownership records that might be examined. Transferring money from Swiss accounts required financial transactions that left paper trails. Activities that had seemed safe during the chaotic 1940s and quiet 1950s became dangerous during the investigative 1960s. Some wives withdrew from the networks, deciding that the risk of prosecution outweighed the obligation to help old comrades. Others doubled down, believing that abandoning the networks would constitute betrayal of their husbands' memories. The network began fragmenting as different participants reached different conclusions about acceptable risk. Technology was making hiding more difficult. Computer databases, still primitive by later standards but far more powerful than paper filing systems, allowed investigators to cross-reference information in ways previously impossible. A pension application under one name could be compared against denazification records under another name. Bank account information could be matched against property ownership records. Patterns became visible that had been obscured when information existed only in separate paper files in different offices. In 1963, a research team in West Germany began compiling a comprehensive database of all known Nazi Party members, cross-referenced with post-war records of where they had settled. The database revealed that many high-ranking Nazis had returned to positions of influence in West German government, business, and academia. The revelation sparked protests and demands for more thorough denazification than had occurred in the late 1940s. The database also revealed the wives, women who had claimed during denazification proceedings to have had no involvement with Nazi organizations, appeared in records as party members themselves, sometimes holding leadership positions in women's auxiliary groups. The documentation proved what many had denied: active participation rather than passive association. These accumulating exposures created a climate where secrets became liabilities rather than protections. Women who had successfully hidden their butts for 20 years now faced the possibility of discovery through methods that had not existed when they created their false identities. The calculus of concealment was changing. By 1970, the landscape of secrecy had been transformed. What had been hidden was increasingly exposed. Who had been forgotten was increasingly remembered. Networks that had operated invisibly were increasingly documented. The wives faced a choice: continue hiding and risk eventual exposure with all its consequences, or come forward voluntarily and shape their own narratives before investigators shaped those narratives for them. Some chose confession, though confession is perhaps too strong a word. They chose limited disclosure, admitting certain facts while maintaining deniability about others. These calibrated revelations allowed them to appear cooperative while still protecting themselves from full accountability. Others maintained silence, calculating that saying nothing remained safer than saying anything. They had maintained false identities for decades. Why abandon successful strategies now just because pressure had increased? These women became increasingly isolated as networks collapsed around them, but they persisted in their transformations until death released them from the burden of maintaining lies. The surfacing of secrets represented a kind of historical accountability, operating on timescales longer than individual justice. The immediate post-war years had seen trials and punishments, but those had focused on major offenders whose crimes were undeniable. The longer reckoning examined complicity, benefit, and the infrastructure that had enabled both the crimes themselves and the escapes afterward. This slower justice was less dramatic than Nuremberg trials, but it was perhaps more thorough in its insistence that everyone involved, however peripherally, would eventually face accounting. Silence is not merely the absence of sound, it is an active force, a deliberate choice to withhold what could be spoken. For 30 years, the Nazi wives maintained a silence about their experiences, their knowledge, and their complicity. But silence, like all human constructs, proves vulnerable to forces that insist upon speech. The breaking began in 1978 with a television broadcast that reached 120 million Americans. The miniseries was called simply Holocaust. 9.5 hours across 4 nights, it told the story of 2 families during the Nazi era, one Jewish, one German. The Jewish family, the Weisses, suffered deportation, separation, and murder in the camps. The German family, the Dorfs, included a character who rose through the SS ranks to become a camp commandant. The narrative was fictional, but the history it depicted was not. 120 million viewers represented nearly half of all Americans at that time. The broadcast sparked conversations in living rooms, classrooms, and workplaces across the United States. But its impact extended beyond America. The series was dubbed into German and broadcast in West Germany in January 1979, where it reached 20 million viewers, an even larger proportion of the German population. For many Germans, particularly those born after the war, Holocaust provided their first detailed exposure to what the Nazi regime had actually done. The education system had addressed the topic, but often abstractly, focusing on political history rather than personal stories. The mini-series made it personal, showing the progression from discrimination to deportation to murder through characters viewers came to know over hours of programming. The broadcast triggered something unexpected. The wives' children started, asking questions their mothers had spent 3 decades avoiding. Consider the position of these children. They had been born into or grew up in families marked by association with Nazi crimes, but many had never been told the full extent of what their fathers had done. Their mothers had maintained silence, offering vague explanations when pressed, changing subjects when questions became too specific, creating an atmosphere where certain topics were understood to be forbidden without ever being explicitly prohibited. Now these adult children, some in their 30s and 40s, watched television programs depicting the realities their mothers had witnessed or known about. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable. How could the loving mother who had raised them have lived alongside such horror without intervening, without objecting, without at minimum expressing doubt? Some confronted their mothers directly, demanding explanations. Others began independent investigations, seeking documents and testimonies that might reveal what their families had actually done and known. A few chose public reckoning, publishing memoirs and giving interviews that broke family silence in the most complete way possible. Nicholas Frank chose the most brutal form of truth-telling. His father, Hans Frank, had been Governor-General of occupied Poland from 1939 to 1945. During those 6 years, 4 million Jews were murdered in Poland under his administration. Hans Frank had been tried at Nuremberg, convicted and executed by hanging in October 1946. Nicholas was 7 years old when his father died. His mother, Brigitte Frank, had lived in Krakow's Wawel Castle during the occupation, one of Poland's most historic and beautiful buildings. She had hosted receptions, worn designer clothing, and been photographed for German magazines showcasing the glamorous life of Nazi leadership families. After the war, she maintained that she had known nothing about the murders occurring across the territory her husband governed. Nicholas Frank did not believe his mother's claims of ignorance. In 1987, he published Der Vater eine Abrechnung, which translates to The Father, a Settling of Accounts. The book was not a balanced historical assessment. It was an act of literary violence against his father's memory, describing him as a monster whose execution was deserved and whose memory deserved only contempt. But Frank's rage extended beyond his dead father to his still living mother. He described in precise detail the furs she had worn during the war years, furs made from pelts confiscated from Warsaw ghetto deportees. He documented the jewelry she had kept, pieces that had belonged to murdered Jewish families. He listed the paintings that had hung in their castle residence, looted from Polish collections and Jewish homes. Most devastatingly, he described her deliberate amnesia about the source of her luxury. She had claimed not to know where the furs came from, not to recognize that jewelry accompanying deportation might have belonged to the deported, not to question why suddenly so much Polish art became available for German acquisition. Frank characterized this willful ignorance as a form of complicity worse than his father's direct perpetration, because it required constant, active maintenance of delusion. His mother never forgave him for the book. They ceased communication. She maintained until her death in 1963 that she had been unfairly portrayed, that Nicholas had betrayed family loyalty for commercial success and public attention. But the book sold widely in Germany, becoming required reading in many schools, forcing a generation to confront not just what Nazi leaders had done, but what their families had known and ignored. Frank's example inspired others. Children of Nazi families began writing memoirs, giving interviews, and participating in documentaries that explored their complicated inheritances. Some expressed rage similar to Frank's. Others showed more sympathy for their mothers, while still acknowledging what had occurred. A few defended their families entirely, but these defensive accounts were increasingly rare as documentation made denial untenable. The testimonies followed a recognizable pattern. First came denial, the claim that nothing unusual had been known or witnessed. Then partial admission, acknowledgement of some suspicious circumstances, but insistence that full scope remained hidden. Finally, full revelation that stopped just short of accepting personal culpability. Emmy Goering's 1973 autobiography exemplified this progression. Titled An der Seite meines Mannes, or At My Husband's Side, it was published when she was 80 years old, 2 years before her death. The book claimed she had suspected something was wrong during the Nazi years, but insisted, what could one woman do? Against the machinery of a totalitarian state, the phrasing was carefully constructed. Suspected something was wrong? Acknowledged awareness without specifying what was suspected or when suspicions arose. What could one woman do? Positioned her as powerless, despite the immense privileges her position had provided. The framing made her seem like a victim of circumstances rather than a beneficiary of crimes. What Emmy Goering's autobiography omitted was as revealing as what it included. She did not mention that her personal servant was a Jewish slave laborer named Rosa, forced to work in the Goering household under threat of deportation. She did not explain what happened to Rosa when she was no longer useful. Though records indicate Rosa was transported to Ravensbrück concentration camp in 1943 and did not survive, she glossed over the art collection's origins, describing paintings as acquired without detailing the acquisition process. She mentioned attending social functions with other Nazi wives, but claimed the conversations focused on domestic matters rather than politics. She described the end of the war as a personal tragedy, losing everything she had built, without acknowledging that what she had built rested on foundations of theft and murder. These autobiographical works became historical records despite their self-serving nature. Historians recognize them as primary sources requiring critical analysis, documents that revealed as much through omission and euphemism as through direct statement. 12,000 hours of video testimony were eventually compiled from Nazi wives and their children, creating an archive that showed how ordinary privilege intertwined with extraordinary evil. The technology that made hiding increasingly difficult also preserved these testimonies in ways previous generations could not have managed. Videotape captured not just words, but tone, facial expressions, and body language. A woman claiming ignorance while smiling slightly, or expressing regret while maintaining eye contact that suggested defiance, revealed complexities that written transcripts could not convey. Researchers analyzing these testimonies identified common rhetorical strategies. The passive voice appeared frequently. Jews were deported rather than Germans deported Jews, or my husband deported Jews. This grammatical choice removed agency, making historical events seem like natural occurrences rather than deliberate actions by identifiable people. Euphemism replaced direct language. Wives spoke of resettlement programs rather than deportations, work camps rather than death camps, special treatment rather than murder. These were the same euphemisms the Nazi regime had used in its official documents, suggesting that wives had internalized the regime's linguistic evasions so thoroughly they continued using them decades after the regime's collapse. Temporal vagueness obscured timelines of knowledge. Eventually, I learned, left unclear whether learning occurred during the war or after it ended. Later, it became apparent, suggested information emerged gradually rather than being immediately obvious. In hindsight, positioned understanding as only possible from future perspective rather than available in real time. But not all testimonies employed these evasive strategies. Some wives and their children spoke with brutal directness about what had been known, done, and witnessed. These candid accounts were often more disturbing than the evasive ones because they revealed the ordinariness of evil, how people could commit or facilitate atrocities while maintaining normal family lives. Margaret Buber-Neumann's testimony exemplified this directness. She had not been a Nazi wife, but had been imprisoned in both Soviet gulags and Nazi concentration camps, giving her unique perspective on totalitarian systems. After the war, she testified extensively about what she had witnessed, including interactions with Nazi wives who visited camps where their husbands worked. Buber Neumann described wives arriving for social visits, being given tours of camp facilities that carefully avoided the areas where executions and torture occurred, then attending dinner parties in commandants' homes located just outside camp perimeters. The wives would complain about food shortages in Germany while eating meals prepared using supplies confiscated from prisoners. They would discuss servant problems while being served by prisoners working as forced labor. The juxtaposition was so extreme, it seemed surreal. But multiple testimonies confirmed similar experiences. The camps existed simultaneously as sites of horror and as communities where Nazi officials and their families lived apparently normal domestic lives. Children attended schools, wives organized social events, families celebrated holidays, all within sight and smell of facilities where mass murder occurred daily. This normalization of horror raised disturbing questions about human adaptability. How quickly can people adjust to extraordinary circumstances until they become ordinary? What mechanisms allow humans to compartmentalize, to maintain normal emotional lives while participating in or adjacent to systematic evil? Psychological research into these questions intensified during the 1980s and 90s. Studies of concentration camp guards and their families revealed that most were psychologically normal by standard diagnostic measures. They were not sadists or psychopaths, just ordinary people who had adapted to extraordinary circumstances until those circumstances seemed normal. The wives' testimonies contributed data to this research. Their descriptions of daily life in Nazi households, their accounts of what they had known and not known, their explanations of how they had justified or avoided justifying their circumstances, all provided insight into how normal humans accommodate evil. But testimonies also served functions beyond research. For some wives and their children, speaking publicly represented a form of atonement, an acknowledgement that silence had been a form of continued complicity. The act of testimony broke silence even when the content of testimony remained partially evasive. By speaking at all, they admitted there was something to speak about. For others, testimony served defensive purposes, an opportunity to shape narratives before investigators or historians shaped them less favorably. By controlling the story, they could emphasize ignorance, powerlessness, or opposition while minimizing knowledge, privilege, or benefit. The testimonies became performative, demonstrations of appropriate regret designed to satisfy social expectations without necessarily reflecting internal reality. Holocaust survivors who listened to these testimonies often expressed frustration at their incompleteness and evasiveness. Survivors wanted full acknowledgement of what had been done and known, direct statements of guilt and responsibility, concrete expressions of remorse that went beyond formulaic apologies. What they often received instead were carefully modulated statements that admitted minimum necessary facts while preserving maximum possible innocence. The tension between what survivors needed to hear and what wives were willing to say never fully resolved. Some encounters between survivors and perpetrators' families achieved genuine reconciliation through complete honesty on both sides. But many more remained trapped in mutual dissatisfaction. Survivors feeling they had not received adequate accounting, wives feeling they had been unfairly judged for circumstances beyond their control. The children occupied particularly difficult positions. They had not chosen their parents, had not committed crimes themselves, yet carried names and inheritances that linked them permanently to Nazi crimes. Some changed their names, attempting to sever association. Others kept their names but devoted their lives to activism, opposing fascism and racism. A few embraced their heritage, becoming neo-Nazi activists who explicitly defended their parents' actions. The majority existed somewhere between these extremes, neither fleeing their history nor embracing it, but attempting to live normal lives while acknowledging abnormal pasts. They gave testimony when asked, attended commemorations when appropriate, and tried to ensure their own children understood history's lessons. It was a difficult balance, accepting responsibility for things they had not done, while avoiding the paralysis that excessive guilt could produce. By the late 1990s, most Nazi wives had died. Emmy Goering died in 1973, Margaret Himmler in 1967, Gerda Bormann in 1987. Their deaths closed opportunities for direct testimony, making the 12,000 hours of recorded interviews increasingly valuable as primary sources for historians studying the period. But the children remained, and some of their children had children, creating a third generation removed from direct experience, but still connected through family history. These grandchildren grew up hearing stories filtered through multiple layers of narrative construction, each generation shaping testimony to serve different purposes. The breaking of silence that began in 1978 continued through subsequent decades, not as a single moment, but as an ongoing process. Each new generation asked questions the previous generation had avoided. Each new documentary or book or memorial prompted additional testimony. Each death of a witness created urgency to record testimony from remaining witnesses before they too died and their knowledge disappeared. The silence was broken, but what emerged was not simple truth. It was complex, contradictory, self-serving, occasionally honest, frequently evasive testimony that revealed as much about human nature as about historical events. The wives had broken their silence, but the breaking itself was partial, strategic, and often motivated by factors other than pure desire for truth. What remained was a vast archive of human voices speaking across decades about complicity, knowledge, guilt, and memory. The archive does not provide simple answers because the questions it addresses are not simple. But it provides evidence, testimony that future generations can examine, analyze, and learn from. Voices preserved through technology, speaking truths and evasions that illuminate the complicated landscape between innocence and guilt, where most human experience actually resides. Time does not erase. It transforms, but the material remains, changed in form but not eliminated. Geologists understand this principle when examining rock strata, where ancient events leave permanent signatures. Historians understand it when examining how past atrocities shape present consciousness. In 2018, 73 years after the Reich's collapse, a Munich court confronted inheritance, both material and psychological, that refused to dissolve despite decades of attempted forgetting. The case involved 3 paintings: a landscape by a Dutch master, a portrait attributed to the workshop of Rembrandt, and a still life whose provenance traced through centuries of European collecting. The paintings had hung in Henrietta von Schirach's Vienna apartment during the war years. When she fled in 1945, the paintings traveled with her, hidden first beneath hay bales, then stored in Swiss bank vaults where they remained for 73 years, while legal complexities prevented their resolution. Henrietta had died in 2008 at the age of 91. Having successfully transformed from Hitler Youth leader's wife to anonymous Munich resident. But death does not end legal matters when property is involved. Her heirs inherited not just the paintings, but the questions those paintings embodied. Who had owned them before Henriette acquired them? How had they been acquired? And what obligations did current possession create? The research took years. Art historians traced the paintings through auction records, gallery sales, and private collections backward through time. The landscape had belonged to the Rosenberg family of Amsterdam, prominent art dealers whose collection was systematically looted by Nazi officials. The portrait had hung in a Berlin apartment owned by the Gutmann family, bankers who fled Germany in 1937, leaving behind art they could not transport. The still life's trail was less clear, but documentation suggested it had been purchased at an auction where Jewish families were forced to sell possessions before deportation, sales conducted under duress that invalidated any claim of legitimate transfer. The painting's combined value exceeded 40 million euros. The heirs argued they had inherited the paintings legally, that Henriette had owned them for decades without challenge, that statute of limitations should apply after such extended possession. The plaintiffs, descendants of the original Jewish owners, argued that theft remains theft regardless of time elapsed, that stolen property does not become legitimate through prolonged possession, that justice delayed is still justice. The Munich court ruled for the plaintiffs. The paintings would be returned to the families from whom they had been stolen, or to those families' descendants, along with financial compensation for the 7 decades during which the rightful owners had been deprived of their property. The monetary value was substantial, but the legal principle was more valuable. Nazi-looted art remained looted, regardless of how much time passed or how many transfers of possession occurred. The ruling established precedent that reverberated through European legal systems. It meant that paintings hanging in museums, displayed in private homes, or stored in bank vaults across Europe could be challenged by heirs of murdered families. It meant that the art market would need to conduct more rigorous provenance research before sales. It meant that Swiss bank secrecy, which had protected Nazi assets for decades, would face increased pressure to reveal holdings that might represent stolen property. But the case revealed something beyond art and law. The detailed records of how Nazi wives had systematically laundered stolen assets through neutral countries provided a template for understanding how such operations work. The methods Henriette von Schirach had used in 1945, hiding valuables in children's toys, storing them in Swiss vaults, waiting for time to obscure origins, were not unique to Nazi fugitives. They were standard techniques for anyone seeking to transform illegitimate wealth into apparently legitimate holdings, and those techniques had been replicated in every genocide since. In Rwanda during 1994, Hutu genocidaires murdered approximately 800,000 Tutsis in 100 days. When the Rwandan Patriotic Front ended the genocide, the perpetrators fled to neighboring countries. Many took their families. The wives of genocide leaders followed patterns remarkably similar to Nazi wives: flight through religious institutions, use of forged documents, reliance on ethnic networks in host countries, systematic laundering of assets through banks that asked few questions. In Serbia, during the 1990s, Bosnian Serb forces committed atrocities including the Srebrenica massacre, where more than 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys were murdered. When international pressure intensified, war criminals' families activated escape networks through Orthodox monasteries that paralleled the Catholic rat lines that had helped Nazis. The geographic routes differed, but the organizational logic was identical. In Cambodia, between 1975 and 1979, the Khmer Rouge murdered approximately 2 million Cambodians. When Vietnamese forces overthrew the regime, Khmer Rouge leaders fled to Thai border regions where their families joined them. The wives used the same strategies: new identities, claimed ignorance of their husbands' crimes, exploitation of host countries' political calculations that prioritized anti-communist credentials over justice for genocide victims. The patterns persisted because they worked. Religious institutions provided cover because they prioritized redemption over justice. Neutral countries accepted refugees with capital because economics trumped morality. Host communities protected ethnic compatriots because group loyalty exceeded universal principles. The infrastructure of escape existed independently of any specific genocide, ready to be activated whenever atrocities produced fugitives needing networks. Even the coded communication systems reappeared. In 1998, Spanish investigators discovered that Argentine military officers' wives who had participated in disappearances during Argentina's dirty war were communicating through classified ads in Buenos Aires newspapers. The codes were different. The language was Spanish rather than German, but the system was identical. Roses need pruning meant safe house available. Garden tools for sale meant forged documents obtainable. The wives had learned from historical precedent, adapting proven methods to new circumstances. This repetition across genocides reveals something disturbing about human organizational capacity. The same creativity and coordination that enables remarkable achievements also enables systematic evil and its aftermath. Networks for helping fugitives escape justice are marvels of planning and execution, testimony to human ability to coordinate complex operations across vast distances. That such ability serves evil purposes does not diminish the organizational sophistication involved. It simply demonstrates that organizational capacity is morally neutral, equally available for good or evil purposes. Modern Germany processes this history through what psychologists call transgenerational trauma, the passing of psychological effects through generations beyond those who directly experience traumatic events. Studies conducted between 2000 and 2015 examined 3,000 descendants of Nazi perpetrators, comparing their psychological profiles against control groups. The results were striking. Depression rates among Nazi descendants were triple the national average. Suicide rates were double. Anxiety disorders appeared significantly more frequently than in the general population. The trauma manifested physically as well. Higher rates of stress-related illnesses, sleep disorders, and psychosomatic conditions. The mechanism of transmission remains debated. Genetic components may exist, epigenetic changes that alter how genes express themselves across generations. But environmental transmission seems more significant. Growing up in families marked by association with genocide creates psychological burdens that shape personality development, relationship patterns, and worldview. Some descendants describe feeling guilty for things they did not do, as though they inherited responsibility along with names. Others report feeling angry at being judged for family history beyond their control. Many experience both simultaneously, trapped between accepting connection to past evil and rejecting blame for actions they never committed. Yet, from this darkness emerges unexpected light. Some descendants have transformed inherited guilt into activism, dedicating their lives to preventing future atrocities and supporting victims of historical crimes. The transformation of burden into purpose provides meaning while acknowledging history. Rainer Höss exemplifies this path. His grandfather, Rudolf Höss, commanded Auschwitz, overseeing the murder of more than 1 million people. Rudolf Höss was executed in 1947, but his legacy extended through his descendants. Rainer grew up knowing his family name was synonymous with history's worst crimes. For years, he struggled with shame and anger. Then in 2014, he met Eva Kor, an Auschwitz survivor who had been subjected to medical experiments by Josef Mengele. Eva had dedicated her life to education about the Holocaust and to a radical concept, forgiveness. Not forgiveness that excused crimes or minimized suffering, but forgiveness as liberation from the burden of hatred. Rainer and Eva began traveling together, speaking at schools, universities, and commemorative events. Their joint testimony was more powerful than either could achieve alone. Eva could describe what happened in Auschwitz from a survivor's perspective. Rainer could describe the psychological cost of being descended from perpetrators. Together, they demonstrated that reconciliation was possible without forgetting, that descendants could acknowledge family evil without being destroyed by it, that survivors could forgive without betraying those who did not survive. Eva died in 2019 at age 85, but the model of reconciliation she and Rainer established continues. Other descendants of Nazi perpetrators have partnered with Holocaust survivors to provide educational testimony. The partnerships break down the simple binary of perpetrator versus victim, revealing the complicated human realities that exist in both categories' aftermath. These reconciliation efforts face criticism from some who believe that descendants of perpetrators have no right to claim victim status. that their psychological suffering is incomparable to genocide survivors' trauma, that their efforts at reconciliation serve their own needs for absolution rather than victims' needs for justice. The criticism has merit. Descendants did not suffer genocide. Their trauma is real but different in kind and degree from survivor trauma, yet the reconciliation work serves purposes beyond individual psychology. It demonstrates to audiences that the weight of history can be acknowledged without crushing those who carry it. It shows that accepting responsibility for family evil does not require personal destruction. It proves that education about genocide can come from unexpected sources, that sometimes a perpetrator's descendant can reach audiences that survivors cannot. The children and grandchildren of Nazi wives occupy particularly complex positions in this landscape. Their mothers and grandmothers were not primary perpetrators, but were complicit beneficiaries. They wore the stolen jewelry, lived in the confiscated homes, ate the food purchased with plundered wealth. Their guilt exists in shades of grey rather than black and white, making moral evaluation more difficult than for direct perpetrators. Some of these descendants have become activists against fascism and racism, explicitly repudiating their family histories while acknowledging them. Others have become historians, studying their own family's involvement in Nazi crimes with scholarly rigor. A few maintain that their mothers and grandmothers were victims of circumstance, women who had no power to resist their husbands or the regime. The debate about wives' complicity continues to generate scholarly disagreement. Some historians argue that women in patriarchal societies lacked sufficient power to be held equally accountable with men who actually controlled policy and operations. Others counter that wives of elite Nazis possessed privilege that made them more powerful than most German men, that their gender does not excuse their benefit from and participation in genocide's social infrastructure. The legal systems that processed Nazi wives made varying judgments about this question, as documented earlier, but legal judgment and moral judgment are not identical. A court might find insufficient evidence to convict, or might determine that specific actions do not meet legal definitions of criminality, while moral evaluation concludes that behavior was reprehensible regardless of legal technicalities. This gap between legal and moral judgment creates space where Nazi wives' descendants struggle. Their mothers and grandmothers were often not convicted of crimes or received minimal sentences, suggesting legal systems found limited guilt. But moral judgment, informed by fuller understanding of what occurred and what was known, often concludes greater culpability than courts assigned. Living with this discrepancy requires psychological flexibility. It means accepting that legal innocence does not equal moral innocence, that authorities' decisions reflect limited information and political calculations rather than absolute truth, that family members can be loved while their actions are condemned. Modern Germany institutionalizes this complicated remembering through memorials, museums and educational programs that present Holocaust history without simplifying it into comfortable narratives. The German approach acknowledges that most Germans were neither heroes nor monsters, but ordinary people who made compromises, maintained ignorance, and benefited from others' suffering. The wives fit perfectly into this category of complicated complicity. Berlin's Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe, opened in 2005, consists of 2,711 concrete pillars of varying heights arranged in a grid pattern. Visitors walk between the pillars, which create a maze-like experience where sightlines are blocked and orientation becomes difficult. The design intentionally creates discomfort, preventing the easy commemoration that might allow visitors to feel they have adequately processed history by simply visiting a memorial. The wives are not explicitly mentioned in the memorial, but they are implicitly present. The murdered Jews, whose memory the memorial honors, were murdered by systems that required not just perpetrators, but supporters, beneficiaries, and those who looked away. The wives existed in all three categories. By acknowledging the full system rather than focusing only on primary perpetrators, the memorial includes even those whose complicity was indirect. Educational programs in German schools now teach about the wives as part of Holocaust education. Students learn not just about camp commandants and SS officers, but about the social networks that supported them, the families that benefited from their crimes, and the women who maintained homes while their husbands organized murder. The goal is not to blame women specifically, but to illustrate how genocide requires broad participation across society, how evil functions through ordinary people making ordinary choices that accumulate into extraordinary catastrophe. This educational approach produces mixed results. Some students gain sophisticated understanding of complicity and moral responsibility. Others become overwhelmed by history's complexity and retreat into simple narratives where everyone is either purely good or purely evil. Teachers navigate between providing nuanced truth and avoiding paralysis that prevents any moral judgment. The echoes continue reverberating through time because the fundamental questions remain unresolved. How do we balance acknowledgement of past crimes with allowing present and future generations to live without inherited guilt? How do we ensure justice for victims while avoiding collective punishment of descendants? How do we remember atrocities without creating trauma that damages those who were not present when atrocities occurred? These questions have no universal answers because different cultures and different individuals reach different conclusions based on varying values. Some believe that inherited property requires inherited responsibility, that descendants who benefit from stolen wealth must return it regardless of personal innocence. Others believe that justice cannot extend beyond those who actually committed crimes, that descendants should not face consequences for actions they did not choose. Both positions have moral logic. Both create practical difficulties. The Munich court's 2018 ruling that Nazi-looted art must be returned to victims' descendants reflects one approach. But that approach raises questions about time limits. Should claims be valid indefinitely? If someone's great-great-grandparents were robbed 5 generations ago, do their descendants have claims against current holders of that property who may have purchased it legally and in good faith? The answers depend on context, on what was stolen, on how it was stolen, on whether current holders knew about origins. Simple rules fail because situations are complicated. Case-by-case adjudication is necessary, but time-consuming and incomplete. The legal systems struggle with questions that have no perfect solutions, only better and worse approximations of justice. What remains clear 79 years after the Reich's collapse is that the story is not finished. New information continues emerging as archives open and witnesses provide testimony. New descendants are born carrying names connected to history's crimes. New conversations occur as societies continue processing what happened and what it means. The Nazi wives existed at a particular moment in history, but the questions they embodied transcend that moment. What responsibility do families of perpetrators bear? How should societies balance justice with mercy? When does complicity become culpability? These questions apply to every genocide, every mass atrocity, every systematic evil that humans inflict on other humans. The wives' stories provide no comfortable answers, but they provide evidence and examples that help us think more clearly about difficult questions. They show us that evil requires infrastructure, that atrocities depend on broader support networks than just direct perpetrators, that ordinary people with ordinary lives enable extraordinary crimes through small choices that seem insignificant individually but prove catastrophic collectively. They also show us that transformation is possible but incomplete, that people can change identities without changing understanding, that legal accountability is necessary but insufficient for addressing moral questions, that time creates distance but not absolution. The echoes through time carry these lessons forward, transmitted through memorials and museums, through trials and testimonies, through films and books and educational programs. Each generation encounters these stories and must decide what they mean, what obligations they create, what wisdom they offer for preventing future atrocities. The Nazi wives are mostly dead now, their children aging, their grandchildren adults with children of their own. But the questions they embodied live on, echoing through time, asking each generation to grapple with complicity, guilt, knowledge, and the complicated space between innocence and evil where most human life actually occurs. The echoes will continue as long as humans remember history and struggle to understand how ordinary people participate in extraordinary evil, a struggle that seems likely to continue as long as humans exist.